October 12, 1997. A small experimental aircraft goes down off the coast of Pacific Grove, California. John Denver. Dead at 53. America's most beloved folk singer. Gone in seconds. And Willie Nelson. Said nothing. Not publicly. Not in interviews. Not in the tributes that poured out from every corner of the music industry. Complete silence. From one of John Denver's closest friends in the business. For 27 years. Nobody asked why. Nobody pushed. Nobody pulled at that thread. Until now. Because at 92 years old, Willie Nelson finally said what he's been carrying since that October night. And what he revealed dismantles everything the music industry told you about both of them. We were all told the same story about John Denver. The wholesome folk singer. Rocky Mountain High. Take me home country roads. Sunshine on my shoulders. The clean-cut optimist from Colorado. Pure. Gentle. Simple. America's sweetheart in flannel. And we were told the same story about Willie Nelson. The outlaw. The rebel. Braids and bandana. Whiskey and weed. The anti-establishment country maverick who didn't follow anybody's rules. Two completely different artists. Two completely different worlds. That's the controlled narrative version. The one the industry packaged and sold for 50 years. But I went back through the archived interviews. The backstage accounts from people who were there. The moments that never made it into the official biographies. And what I found is that the story of Willie Nelson and John Denver is not the story you were told. Not even close. Let's start where the real story starts. Not with the music. With the pressure. Because both of these men were fighting the same war. Just in different uniforms. John Denver arrived in the early 1970s with a sound that the industry immediately tried to control. Too soft for rock. Too pop for country. Too genuine for the calculated radio formats that were dominating American music. Executives told him to change his image. Sharpen his edges. Make his music easier to package. Denver refused. Every single time. He wrote what he felt. He sang what he meant. He stayed stubbornly, almost aggressively authentic. In an industry that treated authenticity as a liability. Willie Nelson knows that fight personally. Because he was fighting the exact same battle. In Nashville. Where producers told him his voice was wrong. His phrasing was off. His style didn't fit the polished commercial sound that sold records. The Nashville machine tried to sand him down into something marketable. And Willie Nelson walked away instead. Moved back to Texas. Built the outlaw country movement from scratch. On his own terms. Two men. Same industry. Same pressure. Same refusal. That's what connected them. Not the music on the surface. The war underneath it. And here's the first detail that the official biography of their friendship always leaves out. When they crossed paths at charity events and televised specials in the late 1970s and early 1980s. The conversation backstage wasn't small talk. It wasn't industry networking. It wasn't two famous people being professionally pleasant to each other. Willie Nelson revealed that backstage at one of those events, Denver pulled him aside and said something that Willie never forgot. He said he just wanted to write what he felt. And sing it honestly. No matter what New York or Los Angeles thought. Willie's response when he shared this publicly at 92? That hit me deep. I respected that. 4 words. That hit me deep. From a man who has crossed paths with every significant figure in American music for 7 decades. Those 4 words mean something specific. They mean recognition. One fighter seeing another fighter. Through completely different styles. Completely different images. Completely different public personas. The same stubborn refusal to become what the industry needed them to be. But here's the part of this story that nobody has properly examined. And this is where I need you to pay close attention. Because this is where the surface narrative starts to crack. John Denver in the mid-1980s was in trouble. Not financially. Not professionally. Personally. His marriage to Annie Martel was ending badly. The divorce proceedings were brutal and public. The image of the wholesome Colorado folk singer was getting complicated very fast. And here's what the controlled narrative around Denver's legacy has always carefully managed. The drinking. The DUI arrests. 1993 and 1994. A man who sang about sunshine and mountain air. Getting arrested for drunk driving. Twice. The industry handled it quietly. The fan base was largely shielded from the severity of it. The public image of gentle John Denver survived mostly intact. Because the machine that built that image was very good at protecting it. But Willie Nelson knew. Because Willie Nelson had been through his own version of that darkness. The drinking. The chaos of early marriages. The IRS seizure of virtually everything he owned in 1990. The kind of personal devastation that doesn't make it into the carefully managed Wikipedia biography. Two men who the public saw as opposite extremes were actually living parallel versions of the same complicated human experience. And the industry was carefully making sure nobody noticed the overlap. Now here's the midpoint of this story. The part that changes everything you thought you knew. Willie Nelson stayed publicly silent about John Denver for 27 years. Entire decades of interviews. Thousands of questions from journalists. Documentaries. Memoirs. Television specials. And in all of that, almost nothing about Denver. Ask yourself why. A man who speaks openly about nearly everything. Who has been famously candid about his marriages. His finances. His drug use. His feuds. His failures. That same man maintained near total public silence about one of his closest peers in the music world. For 27 years. That's not coincidence. That's a decision. And decisions like that always have a reason underneath them. I went back through the archived accounts of Denver's final years. The period between his second DUI in 1994 and his death in October 1997. And what multiple sources close to Denver described during that period was a man who felt profoundly misunderstood by his audience, by the industry, by the image that had been built around him. Denver himself said in interviews during those years that he felt trapped inside the public version of himself. That the John Denver America loved didn't leave room for the complicated real person underneath. The same trap that Willie Nelson escaped by becoming the outlaw. By building a persona that explicitly included the darkness. The rebellion. The vice. The struggle. Denver never had that exit. He was too wholesome. Too beloved. Too clean. The image that made him famous became the cage he couldn't escape. And Willie Nelson, who had built his entire career on escaping exactly that kind of cage, watched it happen from the inside of the same industry and said nothing publicly for 27 years. The plane Denver was flying on October 12, 1997 was a Rudin Long Easy, an experimental aircraft. He had recently obtained his pilot's license for that specific type of plane. He was still relatively inexperienced with its controls. The National Transportation Safety Board investigation found that the crash resulted from Denver's inadvertent application of the rudder pedals, which were in an unusual position for his leg length. A mechanical and human error combination. A completely preventable accident. And the industry that had spent 20 years managing his image immediately went to work managing his legacy. The DUI arrests became footnotes. The troubled final years became a brief mention before the tribute. The complicated human being was smoothed back into the wholesome icon. One final time. Permanently. Willie Nelson did not speak publicly. He did not give interviews about Denver in the immediate aftermath. He did not appear at the major public tributes. He processed it privately. Completely. And when he finally opened up at 92, what he described was not the grief of losing a casual industry acquaintance. He described being deeply affected. He described mourning privately. He described songs like Take Me Home, Country Roads and Sunshine on My Shoulders still moving him today. You can feel the love in those songs, he said. They were never just hits. They were gifts. That's not how you talk about someone you barely knew. That's how you talk about someone whose loss still sits somewhere inside you. 3 decades later. And here's what Willie Nelson said that the music industry has spent 50 years avoiding saying directly. He said Denver was misunderstood. That critics dismissed him as too soft. Too sentimental. That the industry and the press never fully gave him credit for the courage it took to stay that genuine. In a world designed to manufacture and manipulate. In this business, people try to mold you into something you're not. John never let that happen. Willie's words. That takes guts. Quiet guts. 2 words that reframe everything. Quiet guts. Not the outlaw's rebellion. Not the rebel's defiance. Quiet guts. The harder kind. The kind that doesn't get songs written about it. The kind that doesn't get a mythology built around it. The kind that just holds its position. Against enormous pressure. Without making any noise about the fight. Willie Nelson at 92 also said something that landed differently than anything else in his remarks. He said that if Denver had lived longer, they might have eventually recorded together. A gentle duet. Blending their distinct voices in tribute to the land they both loved. We were both country boys at heart. Different roads maybe. But the same horizon. That statement is not nostalgia. That statement is grief. The specific grief of a possibility that never became real. Of a collaboration that existed only in the space between 2 people who respected each other. But never fully crossed the distance. Because the industry kept them in separate lanes. Separate audiences. Separate images. And then October 1997 made the distance permanent. Here's what the PR version of both their stories wants you to believe. Willie Nelson is the rebel outlaw. John Denver is the gentle optimist. They occupied different worlds. Occasionally intersected at charity events. Mutually respectful. Nothing deeper. Clean. Simple. Managed. And here's what the evidence actually suggests. 2 men who understood the same thing about the music industry. That it takes from you the moment you let it define you. That the only way to survive it with your soul intact is to refuse. Loudly or quietly. In braids and bandana. Or in flannel and round glasses. Different methods. Same principle. And when one of them didn't make it to 54, the other carried something he didn't talk about publicly. For 27 years. Until he was 92. And finally decided. The silence had lasted long enough. That's the real story of Willie Nelson and John Denver. Not the one the industry built. Not the one that fits neatly into 2 separate legacy boxes. The real one. 2 American originals. Who saw each other clearly. In an industry specifically designed to prevent that kind of clarity. And who never got the chance to make the music they might have made together. Because one October night in 1997, a small plane went down off the California coast. And the horizon they were both heading toward became something only one of them could reach. Willie Nelson isn't the only one carrying a story like this. The music industry is full of silences like his. 27 years of not saying something publicly is never an accident. It's always a choice. And choices like that always protect something. Or someone. The question worth asking is what else Willie Nelson has been quietly carrying. And whether at 92, he's finally ready to say the rest of it. Because if this conversation about John Denver is any indication, the most important things he has to say haven't been said yet. Stay close.